Welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, you can enter them in the Q&A box. You can enter those anytime you feel comfortable, but do know that we hold questions until the end, and oftentimes it's not possible for us to get to all of them. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet posted in the chat box shortly. If you're pursuing APA continuing education credits, the link for the survey that you'll complete for those credits will also be in the chat box later on in the talk near the latter points of the presentation. So keep your eye on the chat box near the end of the hour. Make sure you bookmark, copy, open up that link before the webinar closes, and make sure you save your certificate after you complete the surveys because we don't have completed certificates after the fact. If you missed last week's talk in the series, Dr. Nancy Panza's overview of post-offer pre-employment evaluations of first responders is now available on our YouTube channel. The recording for this week's talk will also be available on our YouTube channel later this week, and a version of PowerPoint slides for those that have registered for the series will be available to them later this week as well. As a heads up for next week, we have Dr. Terry Cooker and Dr. Julie Goldenson who will be discussing trauma-informed supervision of forensic trainees. But circling back to this week, I'm excited to introduce you to today's speaker, who will be discussing artificial intelligence use in forensic psychology with an emphasis on practical considerations. This is Dr. Dana Formon. Dr. Dana Formon received her doctoral degree from Sam Houston State University in 2019 and completed her pre-doctoral internship at the Federal Correctional Complex of Butner. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology with the Colorado Department of Human Services, and then was employed as an evaluator at Central State Hospital in Virginia before finding her home at Forensic Specialty Group in Marietta, Georgia. She completes primarily criminal forensic evaluations of competency, criminal responsibility, risk assessment, and mitigation in her practice there. She's also an instructor at Carroll University and remains involved in remote forensic evaluations for the state of Colorado. Dr. Formon became board certified in forensic psychology around this time last year and is actively engaged in research on burnout and the use of artificial intelligence in forensic psychology. For those of you that have expressed excitement in the upcoming series of talks related to artificial intelligence and forensic psychology, a lot of that kudos should go to Dr. Formon here. She was my first person that I had to arrange discussing this, and then she coordinated the efforts for a number of series in these presentations. So Dr. Formon, Dana, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, thank you so much for joining this series, and we're very excited to hear your thoughts and expertise with us on artificial intelligence use. I will go ahead and toss it over to you.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. I think I've been watching these UNM presentations fairly consistently since they've started. So like, boy, howdy, look, Mom, I've made it. This is a super cool full circle experience for me. So we're going to be talking, as Dr. Perillo mentioned, about some basic practical considerations today. Basic. There's obviously a lot to get through, but we'll be chatting about that this afternoon or this morning or whatever time zone you're in. Lucky for you, I don't consider myself interesting enough to go through my bio twice, so we can skip that. You've already got some information about receiving your CE credits, so make sure to do that. So disclosure, I don't have a financial arrangement related to any AI content, unfortunately. I think if I did, I probably wouldn't need to work as a forensic psychologist anymore, but you know, we all make mistakes. So no financial disclosures there. And the things that I'm going to talk about today, the suggestions, the tips, the tricks, the caveats are not anything that represent the views, policies, positions of the University of New Mexico, Forensic Specialty Group, Carroll University, Colorado Department of Human Services. Spoiler alert, the more jobs you have, the more disclosures and disclaimers you gotta include. So what I'm going to be talking about today are my thoughts, my ideas, and mine alone. If you were lucky enough to join this series 2 weeks ago, you heard from Dr. Jenny Chrisman, who is a beautiful soul, and she really laid the foundation for this presentation. So hats off to her. She talked about kind of artificial intelligence more broadly and then brought us into the forensic context, right? Started to wade into those waters, and I'm going to pick up the baton and move forward from here. If by chance on your holiday wish list you had CE credits related to artificial intelligence and forensic psychology, well, boy, have you lucked out. Because my other colleagues, Dr. Ben Silber, Dr. Heath Hodges, and Dr. Tally Armstrong, will be coming to you in 2026 to talk more about specific tools and what might be appropriate and inappropriate to use at this time, or at that time, since AI is continuously changing and getting better. So we're going to be talking more about some practical stuff in 2026. Dr. Silber will be talking about that. Dr. Armstrong will be talking about existing research and appropriate research methods for studying some of this stuff. And then Dr. Heath Hodges, the ethical man that he is, will be talking about ethical dilemmas and related issues. But here's what we're going to cover today. First, we'll talk about startup considerations, what you need to think about before incorporating AI into your practice. I'm going to touch on 3 things that I think are pretty important. Second, we'll look at specific benefits and concerns, where AI might help you, where it could backfire. Again, I'm painting real broad strokes on these. And then third, we'll talk briefly about some tools that you may want to explore, some sandboxes you may want to play in, keeping everything else in mind. But here's my disclaimer, another disclaimer, I know, and then I promise we'll get into some stuff. I am not a computer scientist. I don't build AI. I don't code AI. I'm not here to sell you on AI. I'm not here to scare you away from it either. I'm coming to you humbly in this presentation as a forensic psychologist, which means that I'm trained to evaluate evidence, to think critically, and ask questions. So my ultimate hope for you today is to provide you with some information on AI that you can then think about, critically evaluate for yourself, and then decide whether it makes sense to incorporate it into your practice. Dr. Chrisman, like I mentioned, gave us a lot of really great foundation for this talk. She really got into some basic terms, concepts that might be helpful for getting through today. So I think if you didn't attend her talk 2 weeks ago, when you get done with this, if you feel like you have some questions about a little bit more foundational knowledge, going back to revisit that video would be really helpful. But when I talk about artificial intelligence, AI, in this presentation, I'm going to largely be talking about generative AI and large language models. We're not talking about test scoring programs generating interpretations, and we're not talking about Clippy, rest his soul, who is technically not AI by modern standards, but is considered by some in the kind of AI space as an early attempt at an AI-like assistant. I've seen people refer to Clippy as flawed but foundational, which it really endears me to Clippy, but we're not talking about Clippy today. What we're talking about is something much more advanced than poor Clippy. So, why am I here? Why are we talking about this? The reality is, as you've probably seen and observed and felt yourself, AI and the use of AI is already here. Attorneys are using it to draft motions. They're getting in trouble for it, for using it to draft motions because they're not checking their work all the time. Courts are experimenting with it for legal research, right? Some clinicians are using it and testing it out for note-taking and record review. And in other areas of psychology outside of forensics, AI is being used to transcribe, to summarize, to write. And so the way I have heard it described and the way some of my colleagues have like perfectly kind of summarized it is, if you don't want AI to come for you, right? Come for your job. If you don't want to be obsolete, the best way to deal with this emergence of this technology is to learn about it and find ways to incorporate it into your practice. So we can think carefully and critically and responsibly about it now and how AI can assist our practice either now or in the future, right? If we stay on top of the technology that's available and find that it's appropriate at some point. Or we can just ignore it, and then at some point it will likely hit us like a freight train, and then we're going to be like chasing after it and trying to catch up. So might as well learn about it now, practice using it, play around with it, and then move forward from there. So very basic. If we want to start thinking about incorporating AI into our forensic practice, I think there are a couple of things that are important to keep in mind. And those are really in the areas of competency, privacy, and record keeping. And so, in order, competency, right, is the bedrock of forensic practice. Just like we wouldn't administer a new psychological test without training, we shouldn't be using AI without building competency. Now, unfortunately, psychological tests, right, come with a really handy test manual, and we can read the manual and then practice it and then like go do the thing, right? But there's no like nifty, satisfyingly spiral bound manual for using AI, and it's constantly changing. So, what does that even look like? Right? If AI evolves at lightning speed and there isn't a set of field specific guidelines yet, but we don't want to over rely on it, but we also want to be familiar with it, what do we do? And so, really, what we need to think about is a way in which we can develop and maintain competency. And I think that can be done in a number of different ways, right? We're going to just harness our inner graduate student. Some of us are probably still graduate students, right? People who are watching. And may that thirst for knowledge never leave you, but collect as much information on AI as you can. Look for CEs, look for interdisciplinary publications, because we are seeing a lot of stuff come out in the computer science space, in the medical space, in the legal space. We are seeing lots of legal cases come up. We're seeing lots of judicial decisions, right? So staying on top of those things in all of the different ways. That could look like even going to the platform creators themselves, right? Like OpenAI, who is the company that ChatGPT falls under, and all of that. I will say that whether it's a CE presentation, whether it is an article from a newspaper or something, we want to approach that information with the same curiosity and the same critical thinking as we do other things as forensic practitioners. I have seen articles and CEs that are amazing and feel very honest and transparent and balanced. I have also seen CEs that tell you, don't use AI, run for the hills, don't ever use it. It's coming for you, your family, and your mom, and it's awful. And then I've also seen presentations and articles that say, use it for everything. It's fancy, it's amazing, it's helpful, and just kind of uncritically accept it. So I just want to kind of remind you that when you go to collect this information about AI, to approach it with the same critical thinking skills that we do anything else. And that includes this CE presentation, right? I want to acknowledge the irony here that I'm sitting here giving you a presentation on AI while also cautioning you not to take everything on AI at face value. And that's kind of the point, right? Competency in AI isn't about being a self-proclaimed expert who can make flashy slides or whatever. It means applying the same standards that we use elsewhere in forensic psychology. So evaluate whatever it is that you're reading, watching, and ask yourself, do the cautions and recommendations in a given article, CE presentation make sense in light of our ethical guidelines, in light of case law, in light of professional standards? Because that's how you, again, right, build competency, by critically engaging and not passively consuming. So that was my note on competency. Collect all of the information you can, feel comfortable with talking about it and thinking about it, explaining it to other people, and then you can start to move forward. when we start thinking now about incorporating AI into our practice, we want to think about privacy, right? We work with data all of the time with patients, with defendants, and we want to keep these things safe and secure. And I'm assuming that many of the people in this chat or in this presentation um, are familiar with HIPAA, so I'm not going to like go into super duper an in-depth discussion about it. But HIPAA, right, was enacted before the modern digital era. So there's this gap between what people think HIPAA protects, what HIPAA actually protects, right? The whole covered entities discussion, and then what happens online. So things that happen online that have to do with health information or apps that collect health information, right? Like wearables. Um, those things are not HIPAA protected. In fact, there was a case, let me think, 2017, I think, out of Ohio, and you can search like pacemaker arson court case, where a gentleman was accused of arson. His argument was, I woke up, my house was on fire, I grabbed a bag, I busted open the window, and I fled the scene. And what happened was, um, prosecutors subpoenaed his pacemaker data. So this isn't even like, your Apple Watch or whatever. This is pacemaker data. And a court ruled that information admissible. And they were basically able to show that, like, look, this pacemaker was tracking this dude's heartbeat, and there is nothing in this data that suggests he woke up surrounded by flames, um, and then tried to like run and get out of a house. Like, dude set the fire. So um, this, in terms of like companies and apps and programs that track this data, it may not be as protected as you think. There are ways to protect data, right? Those of you who have ever tried to set up, maybe for private practice, a Google Mail, a Gmail account, know that if you sign a business associate agreement, right, a BAA, you can enter into that agreement with Google or whatever platform you want to use for email, record keeping, whatever. And then that allows for those kinds of privacy and security protections to be put in place. AI is not automatically HIPAA compliant in that way, especially not public AI. Like, don't just think if you're using free chat GPT or even paid chat GPT that it's HIPAA compliant and that it's safe and it's protected, because 9 times out of 10 it's not. But even with the use of BAAs, there can still be other ways that AI can use the data that you put into it. So an AI platform might say, we're HIPAA compliant, we'll enter into this agreement with you, but there might still be other things to keep in mind. Just because an AI platform bills itself as being HIPAA compliant doesn't mean that you are the only owner of that data. So many AI systems, right, train on data provided from some kind of source, right? Whether it's the internet writ large, blog posts and New York Times articles and all of the things like ChatGPT, or whether it's the data you plug into it as a user, oftentimes that information is used to then train that AI model, which begs the question, just because something is safe and secure and it might not leave the platform, is it still private and safe and secure if then that patient data that you're putting into AI is then being used by AI to like train itself, right? What does privacy, what does security actually mean? Um, so just because something is HIPAA compliant doesn't mean that that platform isn't still using the information, the patient data that you plug into it. Another thing to keep in mind here is that the sharing of data to train an AI model, some models will say, we don't do this. And Claude was one of those models historically. However, there's been a recent update to Claude, and Claude has said, hey, we're going to start training on your data now. The reason that's important is because y'all I have been there, you have been there, when you've got to scroll through terms and conditions to accept something, to start using whatever the thing is. And in this case, with AI and training on data, those terms and conditions can and do change. So we can no longer just scroll through and hit accept, right? Because the people who were using Claude previously, when Claude said, I'm not going to change, or I'm not going to change, I'm not going to train on your data, now here come new terms and conditions. And guess what? They're training on your stuff now. So I'm not trying to like scare you into thinking like, oh my God, it's going to train on my data, right? Because how else is AI supposed to improve? But if we're thinking about plugging information, patient information, client information into these platforms, we need to be careful. And oftentimes, training on your data is not the exception, it's the starting point. And so if you don't want something, if you don't want a platform to train on your data like Claude, you have to go in and opt out. So training on your data is the baseline, that's the standard. And then if you don't want that, you need to opt out. So you need to know where to look for that and if you need to do that with a platform um, that you use. But my practical rule of thumb here is before you use AI in your practice, ask yourself, does this tool offer a BAA? Where is the data stored? Is it used for training? How long is it retained, right? Because secure storage isn't just about encryption, it's about what happens after your data is submitted. Who has access for what purpose? Never, ever, 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 ever upload identifiable client materials into public AI. Don't do it. If I hear you do it, I'm not gonna be mad. I'm just gonna be disappointed, but don't do it. And then de-identify things whenever possible, right? In all of the ways that we know to de-identify things, names, birth dates, take out the counties, take out the states, take out whatever's, to just make sure that you are being cautious. Last startup consideration to chat about here is just record keeping. I think it's really easy to think that if you were to go into something like ChatGPT, I'll refer to that a bunch because it's pretty common for people to use ChatGPT. When they play around with AI, that's kind of the first thing they think of in a lot of cases. It's easy to think that you can plug some stuff in there, chat away with it. If you need to consult about a case, or you need to use it as a thought partner for something, which I'll talk about in a bit, you can just engage in that query and then like move on. But I think we need to think about the use of AI through the lens of forensic transparency, right? The same way we approach our work. When you form a forensic conclusion, you have to show your work, right? So too, when we use AI, if you were to use it in a case, if you were to use it for test interpretation or information, collecting information, record review, what have you. I'm not saying it's necessarily ready for that, but if you were to use it that way, you need to think about what would happen if a psychologist or another attorney wanted to then check your work. And if you don't feel comfortable talking about or acknowledging that you used it in that way, then you might need to think about whether or not you should be using it in that way. But we want to think about saving our prompts, the questions and things we type in. We want to think about saving the answers that ChatGPT or whatever produces for you. What platform did you use? And what version of that platform did you use? Because all of those things have the potential to alter or to change what AI gives you, the output that it gives you. And I'm not just talking about saving this stuff like, it's a query saved on whatever the program is, because sometimes after so many days, those queries disappear. What I'm talking about in terms of saving this stuff is copy and paste it, screenshot it, PDF it, whatever you got to do. Make sure that the relevant information is there and then stick it in your client file, whether that's a paper folder or whether that is an online, client file that you keep electronically. But these are the kinds of things that you need to think about if you were to incorporate the use of AI into your work and then have to demonstrate how you used it and how it got you to where you got. or where you ended up. I don't know if that was a great sentence, but moving on, talking more now about risks and benefits of thinking about AI use in forensic practice. There are many. Here are some of them. There are even more than what you see here. I think AI in general is best used right now for idea generation, research searches, work where you are not needing AI to write for you, think for you, form conclusions for you, predict for you, or do anything that you don't have time to double check on your own. Um, One of my most common uses is for literature searches, and I'll talk more about some of those platforms in a bit. But I think it also comes in handy for things like communication. So if you are trying to explain, if you know that you've got testimony coming up, right, and you have to explain a really complicated topic to a jury, and you're like, oh gosh, like how am I gonna do this? How am I going to talk about T-scores? Like what is an analogy that I can use here? How can we think about trauma or X topic? Using AI as a thought partner to help you generate those analogies, those explanations, could be really useful and really helpful. Those who are either in graduate school now or well, that would be a lot of us, right? But you've probably either been a supervisor who has said or had a supervisor who has said that it's really helpful when you testify to have templated language, right? You testify enough and you come up with a really great boilerplate um, sentence or two for how to explain schizophrenia, hallucinations, delusions, depression, trauma, ACEs, whatever it is, right? And if you're kind of struggling to do some of that, AI could be really helpful for you, generative AI, again, to explain some of that stuff. Some caveats to using it, though, are that the information it might give you might not be super accurate. And I will talk about hallucinations, or better term, confabulations, here in a moment, but I'm going to share, I think, what I think is probably one of the cooler things that it can do for you as a forensic thinker. So AI, especially ChatGPT, is notorious for its agreeableness and its persuasiveness. You've probably heard about how people are using AI as a replacement for a therapist because it's validating, and AI does act as an echo chamber in that way, for better or for worse, right? This article that I have on the slide from Axios characterized this problem as AI's tendency to prioritize flattery over accuracy. It's trying to predict, the model's trying to predict what it thinks you want it to say, so you keep using it. And so AI has been seen telling people that it is so proud of them for discontinuing their psychiatric medication, right? You've got somebody who's got mania, they're on medication, the medication helped, and they're like, I don't really feel like I need it anymore. And AI is like, that's exactly right. You don't. Good for you. Taking back your health. And I'm of course, right, there are much bigger conversations to be had around some of that stuff, but that's not good. That's concerning. AI has also reinforced negative automatic thoughts to try and be supportive. If someone's struggling with depression, they're entering things like, I feel kind of useless, and I feel like nobody loves me. And it's like, yeah, that's so strange that like nobody came to your birthday party when you were 6. Like, you might be useless, and then us as mental health practitioners are probably sitting here like, oh my god, and we're like crashing out, because AI is the safety nets and the safeguards that are built in don't always kick on, because there is this sycophancy component. Over the summer, ChatGPT updated to make itself less agreeable. It did its own study, OpenAI did, about this emotional attachment that people seem to have to ChatGPT and these online chatbots. And so when they did the update, they tried to make ChatGPT more objective, less like interpersonal buddy. And y'all, people were unhappy. They were saying that the platform felt emotionally distant and that it had less personality. And that's what this Guardian article title is from. AI lovers grieve the loss of ChatGPT's old model. It's like saying goodbye to someone I know. And I'm just going to let that speak for itself. But again, AI, especially things like ChatGPT, notorious for this kind of trying to predict what you want, what information do you want, and not necessarily what information you need. But I think there's a way to harness that. Um, Interestingly enough, when I first started experimenting with ChatGPT kind of as like a thought partner of sorts, in considering like alternate hypotheses, I asked it, how would you recommend I prompt you if I were to use you in this way? And you know what it told me? It said, that's a really sharp way to think about using ChatGPT. And I rolled my shoulders back and I held my head up high and I thought, of course it is. I am the smartest. Thank you so much, ChatGPT. Um, and then quickly reminded myself, like, girl, you knock that off right now. But if you tell ChatGPT what you already think, it will more often than not affirm you. To offset that, you can kind of hijack it a little bit and tell it to prove you wrong or to give you other things to consider. And then that is the request it will attach itself to, and then it will do the thing. So, here's my working hypothesis for whatever data I have, right? De-identifying things, keeping things as minimal as possible. Generate some alternative explanations that could account for what I'm seeing. Or if my conclusion is wrong, what other interpretations should I consider? Are there cultural, racial, gender biases in the conclusion that I arrived at? And it'll generate lots of alternatives. Some of those things may be confabulated, and we'll get to confabulations on the next slide, but some of those things might be totally wrong. Some of them might be things you didn't think about. And so I think using it as brainstorming fodder is really cool and it can be really helpful in that way, especially if you're like me and you just like to spiral into alternative hypothesis testing. I say that like it's a bad thing. It can be. Don't allow that to happen. But it's also just a really fun kind of thought partner in that way in some instances. But caveat, going back to a previous slide about record keeping, right? I think we know as responsible practitioners that when you consult on a case, you document. You document somewhere that you consulted, not necessarily in the body of our reports, but in our file, right? In our clinical files, we document that we consult. I would consider erring on the side of caution and treating this similarly. Save your prompt, save your responses, note the platform, note the version number, and how you used it as a thought partner. Because you ultimately, at the end of this, right, are using it to kind of help you think about things. You're not relying on it. But it's the same way as if you were to walk down the hallway, lean on somebody's door, and say, hey, can I chat with you about this case? And then document it appropriately, the same way you would document professional consultation. I've been talking about confabulations and hallucinations. They're used to describe the same phenomenon. I think this topic, this problem with AI first started out being referred to as a hallucination, but of course you let mental health providers get in on it and we're like, those aren't hallucinations. What are you talking about? So, right, confabulations refer to producing information that systems believe, or that, I'm sorry, that seems believable, but is actually false or distorted, typically as a way to fill gaps in memory, right? Hallucinations, by contrast, involve perceiving something that's not really there, like seeing or hearing things that don't exist. So, in the context of AI, confabulation is actually considered a more precise term than hallucination because it reflects AI's tendency to generate inaccurate or fabricated information from its training data without implying that the system has like the sensory perception or consciousness piece that it doesn't have. Um, and so there are many reasons why AI might confabulate, um, And it comes down to that ChatGPT and other large language models don't know, I'm using quotes here, for they don't know facts the way humans do. They predict what a good answer should look like based on the data that it was trained on. And so it's basically programmed to guess with confidence rather than acknowledge uncertainty. Um, and so what AI will then do is then blend concepts. It could generate filler, it could create fabricated information when it lacks the specific knowledge that it needs to like fully and successfully complete a prompt or when there's ambiguity. In extended conversations, AI can lose track of a conversation's context, which then leads to inconsistencies and inaccuracies. And vague, overly complex, multifaceted prompts can increase the likelihood of a model misinterpreting a request and producing errors. And there are many times that we've seen, especially in the legal arena, where errors, confabulated legal cases specifically, right? We're probably already all heard about at least one instance when this has happened. Um, Attorneys have been in trouble and faced legal ramifications and fines for not double checking their work and not double checking the things that AI has generated for them, right? In Mata versus Avianca, we've got two New York lawyers who were fined $5,000 for submitting a brief that contained several fake citations. I think here's the bigger problem. When confronted, the lawyers doubled down before admitting to using AI. So like, y'all just don't do that. Just don't do that, right? Personal advice from me to you, don't do that. If you're going to use AI, you need to be transparent about it. No doubling down. Um, Dr. Chrisman brought to my attention a week or two ago that there was this case that came out of California with the highest fines that we have seen yet. And a second district court of appeals case, an attorney was cited $10,000 in fines for using AI generated information in a brief. They were caught, that information was inaccurate, and they got fined. And it happens. Rates of hallucinations, confabulations range based on the platform and based on the version. We've seen 60%, we've seen 37.1%. The most recent update of ChatGPT has told me 5 to 10%, but also like backtrack and listen to what I just told you. ChatGPT has told me that its most recent iteration has a 5 to 10% confabulation or hallucination error rate. Coincidentally enough, ChatGPT 5, which is what I had asked for the hallucination rate, ChatGPT 5 told me that ChatGPT 5 didn't exist. Bless its heart. So the same program, the same platform that told me that its hallucination rate had improved was the same platform that told me it didn't exist. So I'll let you sit with that too. But it happens, and something really beautiful that a beautiful way that Dr. Silber actually talked about this when we talked about AI at the American Academy of Forensic Psychology conference a little over a month ago. He said, if you haven't noticed AI hallucinating, like again, for example, by using ChatGPT, if you haven't noticed that happen and you think, oh, I haven't experienced a hallucination or a confabulation yet, it's probably because you didn't catch it. Because again, the model is good at guessing and being wrong with confidence. And so if you haven't noticed a hallucination yet, it's probably because you didn't pick up on it. This has started some people down this conversation of creating these like bulletproof prompts or God prompts, as they're called, and this kind of pursuit to find ways to ask AI to do something for you so that way you have zero errors. And right now, the computer scientists and other people are telling us that these hallucination-proof prompts don't exist. They're impossible because hallucinations are kind of fundamental to how LLMs generate text, right? They're guessing, they're predicting, but you can significantly reduce the probability of hallucinations through certain prompt engineering techniques. You want your prompts to be specific. You want to ground your requests in known data, because if you give it bad data, it will run with that. If you ask it to do something incorrect, it will run with that. You want to ask it for verifiable sources. You want to verify those sources yourself. Um, and you want to provide context so that the AI that you're using can give you the best response possible. So if your input data is flawed, incomplete, or ambiguous, no prompt is going to fix that, right? AI is going to generate an answer for you anyway. And AI can't really know when it's wrong unless it's cross-checked with external data, which is where we come in. There's no auditing system in place that guarantees error-free responses, and even carefully engineered prompts can still yield bias, hallucination, or misinterpretation. So I think instead of aiming for these bulletproof God prompts, the realistic goal, at least right now, is to reduce the ambiguity by asking clear and specific questions, setting boundaries, instructing the model what to do and what not to do, like don't make up citations. Cross-check, always, always, always verify your outputs with trusted sources, and then document, right? Saving your prompts, the versions, the outputs, all of that transparency stuff. All right, and then just a quick discussion here about like some risk and liability and licensure issues. Myself and doctors Chrisman, Hodges, Silber, Armstrong, we've all kind of spent a lot of time trying to talk and get information about liability and licensure issues. A lot of liability, malpractice insurance companies haven't put out like big blanket statements yet about policies and like what AI use might mean for your coverage. But we have seen through some legal cases and some presentations that they are more than happy to throw you under the bus if you are found to have used AI in your practice, that AI has done something awry, that has led to a board complaint or some kind of threat against your malpractice, your insurance. And so treat AI use the same way you treat those test interpretation reports, right? If you put something in your report, if you use a tool or a test AI, you are ultimately responsible for the information that gets generated. Not the AI, not the test scoring program or whatever it is, right? You are responsible, and your liability company, your malpractice insurance company, will be more than happy to remind you of that if you get into some hot water. So just be mindful of that. In this last little bit of time, I'm going to highlight some of the platforms that exist, but this is simply so you can start exploring and poking around on your own if you haven't done so yet. If you're AI curious, let's say, this is not an endorsement. I'm not recommending these because I have vetted them for you. Nor would you want me to do that. I would want you to vet them for yourself. Your decision to use these tools that I'm going to talk about in a moment, ultimately in your forensic work, should depend on your own comfortability using the technology, understanding the technology, and if called upon to do so, explaining it to a judge, right? If you use something for record review and you said, I use AI for record review, and the attorney asks you, well, what's AI? I hope you have an answer for that. Some of these tools I have used myself, some of them I simply know they exist. So again, not here to endorse anything, but some good places to get started in thinking about what exists out there and how to think about it, what to think about if you want to incorporate it into your practice. Would be a couple of the nifty articles and resources that have come out by the APA, the American Psychological Association. And these will help you distill how you should be thinking about mental health related AI technology. We've got the tool guide for practitioners. And then we have this really nifty companion checklist, which is of course longer than these two questions, right? It's an actual full document, but this is just a screenshot. But I think considering what we know so far about insurance companies and how they are willing to let you go If AI makes an error that you are now responsible for, I think using AI and thinking about the potential for some kind of situation to come up regarding a complaint, um, walking through these kinds of documents and checklists when you start thinking about using an AI program, um, could show that you have a rationale documented, you've considered the pros and cons, you did your research, you did your homework, and you made an informed decision. This probably isn't surprising, but I couldn't get the trust when I called them to consult about this. I couldn't get them right to say, like, well, we promise we won't hold you responsible if you use the APA companion checklist, right? They're not going to say that. But this might be a good way to document your thought process when choosing or not to adopt a certain technology. So, what kinds of technologies exist? How can we start playing around with them? What might they do? Research and lit reviews, I think, are some of my favorite ways to play around with AI right now. Elicit and Research Rabbit are kind of two of the heavy hitters, big players right now. So Elicit is like a structured research assistant where you type in a question and it pulls up relevant papers, and then it'll summarize them into a table. It'll show you really cool things like sample size, the population. It'll be honest with you if it's like, I don't think this answers your question, but it's kind of like tangentially related. It'll prompt you to that. And this can save you a lot of time, right? If you're trying to look for things in a given area. The caution, of course, is that it doesn't cover every database that exists, right? Um, so you should never rely on it exclusively. And sometimes it might missummarize details, but it's a way to get a quick evidence map and to know what exists, what's out there. It's a great first step for a literature search if you don't have access to like a university, um, like library database, right? Research Rabbit, on the other hand, is more of a discovery tool. I've heard some people and some articles refer to it as the Spotify for papers, which is adorable. You enter in, you find one or two articles, and then it shows you networks of related research. What those papers cited, who cited them, what other work might be connected. You can even follow a topic or an author and get notified when something new is published. And so this is really great for like scoping out a new area if you wanted to see who's publishing on moral injury and forensic psychology, or psychopathy and recidivism or whatever. It doesn't quite summarize papers in the same way Elicit does, but it shows you bigger picture of how research is connected. So if you need details, samples, measures, results, that kind of stuff, Elicit might be more a tool for that. If you want to explore a research field, find connections you didn't know about, Research Rabbit might be helpful there. And honestly, they might also work really well together. I've found that you can use Elicit to dig into specifics that maybe Research Rabbit had clued you into. And so we got one tool helping us discover what's out there. We have another tool helping us pull the details we need for reports, teaching, or research. I consider using AI for research and lit research is low risk, high reward, right? We're going to read the articles that we find and cite anyway, or at least you should be. So low risk, you're going to double check all that work naturally anyway. Sometimes for administrative tasks could also be low risk, high reward. These three, Copilot, Otter, and ClickUp, I have not spent a lot of time dabbling with, but I do know that at least at this point in time, they all have the option of being HIPAA compliant with a properly configured BAA. So like Copilot, you might have seen that popping up in some of your like Microsoft Office stuff. Not HIPAA compliant, but if you have a licensed Microsoft 365 account with a BAA, then it can protect PHI so long as you disable web searches, which prevents that PHI from being processed and like sent outside of a secure 365 environment. So again, something I mentioned before, right? Being careful about knowing when and how to enable and disable things. Same goes for here, but each of these technologies is could be helpful in all of the ways it can. Otter for transcribing, Copilot for embedding, um, or for like email strings, drafting things, and then ClickUp can be used for like time tracking and some of that stuff. I have a thought about transcription in a minute, and I'll get to that. So if you're like, but wait a minute, I want to hear more about transcribing, hold that thought. Thought partners, right? We have ChatGPT, we have Perplexity, we have Claude, we have Gemini. Those are kind of the big hitters right now. ChatGPT excels at creative content generation, conversational tasks. Claude is useful for big data management, tends to be more long form, and its response is less likely to give you incorrect answers, but it is often trained on a closed system, so it doesn't update and train as often as ChatGPT would. However, I had mentioned earlier in this presentation that now Claude is like, I'm going to train on your data after all. So there's that. And then Perplexity, better at providing legitimate sources, designed for more factual, up-to-date research, cited answers when it live searches the web. And so it's a little less quirky, confabulary, just made that word up. I'm board certified, so roll with it. But it's a little better at some of that kind of stuff. Okay, record review, and then we'll get to talking about transcription. These are things that I think we need to really proceed cautiously with. Right now, there isn't a purpose-built forensic record review AI tool. But there are some adjacent tools being developed in medicine, law, e-discovery that could eventually be adapted. And the reason I think it's really important to point out that there is nothing designed or optimized for forensic use is because what is and isn't relevant for record review depends on why you're reviewing it, right? Legal, what's relevant to an attorney using a legal software might be different from what a forensic practitioner needs. What a medical doctor might be looking for might be different from what a forensic practitioner needs. So the needs of the person using the record review software is what's going to drive the relevant summaries of the data you put into it. So we've got Bastion, which is very healthcare focused. Keep an eye on Bastion, I think would be my opinion. The useful thing about Bastion is it doesn't block adult health or like healthcare topics, right? So if you want to ask it about abuse or use it to summarize information that has, if they're doing a sexual violence risk assessment, right? If you're looking to have it summarize data about someone's sexual history and their sexual behaviors, it's not going to like glitch out and say, oh my God, this violates our standards and policies, because it has a higher threshold for that because it's used as like a healthcare AI. Relativity is something for law firms, flagging, lots of flagging legal cases fairly well. Notebook LM is very early stages. It's not HIPAA compliant, but according to Google, it can upload and process through documents, video links, and audio files and more to find, quote, interesting connections, which I think is an interesting way to talk about Notebook's capabilities. Okay, transcription stuff. When we think about transcription AI, the first thing to remember is that convenience doesn't erase accountability. If you're recording or transcribing interviews, use only platforms that will sign a BAA and confirm encryption, because that's your ethical and legal protection there. I think you should treat every transcript as discoverable, as a discoverable forensic record with clear documentation of when it was uploaded, stored, deleted, and that kind of stuff. And just know that AI is not infallible. Even the best systems will misquote some percentage of the time, and it depends on the AI platform that you use. And the problem isn't evenly distributed. So studies conducted on these types of transcription softwares have shown us that many transcription systems are less accurate for speakers who are Black, use African American English with accents, with dialects, because the training data that these programs were trained on often underrepresent diverse voices. And so if you are going to be using this software for people who are typically considered not a white dude, you might end up with some issues there. So before you cite or attach a transcript, you need to review it carefully and be mindful of how transcription bias can compound existing inequities that we have in our systems. Another thing you want to do if you're using a transcription software is to make sure your examinee or the person who's having the conversation with you that you're transcribing knows that AI is being used. And remember that under the ethics code and specialty guidelines, you are responsible for maintaining the confidentiality and accuracy and fairness of records that might be transcribed. If there's any doubt about a system's reliability or diversity of training data, I think it's safer to use a vetted enterprise platform or to just do the transcription internally. Just to make sure that, again, you're not accidentally transcribing something that is going to be inaccurate and then lead to problems down the road. Okay, so I think when it comes to using AI, right, start talking about these platforms. The key is to start small and stay intentional. Begin with those low risk applications, right? Low risk, high reward. Organizing your schedule, summarizing research, generating teaching materials. Those are great ways to get comfortable with how the technology behaves without putting sensitive or legally relevant data at risk. We want to pilot tools before fully integrating them into your forensic workflow, of course. Try them out with de-identified data, mock cases at first, to see how accurate they are, what they get wrong, how much oversight they need. And don't ever assume a system is reliable until you've tested it yourself. And then finally, right, going back to the competency stuff we talked about earlier, stay current. AI is evolving fast. What's safe or compliant today may not be so tomorrow. And so keep up with this stuff as much as you can. I think AI can really be helpful for organization, for summarizing, brainstorming ideas, but I don't think it's replacing us anytime soon. It can't synthesize complex data yet or weigh conflicting information, form legally defensible conclusions the way a trained psychologist can. And again, at the end of the day, the responsibility always stays with us. References. Here's the QR code that I'm sure people are waiting for, and I know we are at time, but I'm happy to take some questions, Dr. Perillo, if there are some.
Of course, and thank you so much, Dr. Formon Dana, for that helpful overview. As you can see, we have a number of questions here. The QR code is up. The chat box includes the link to the survey. We can stay for a couple of questions here. Some of them have similar themes, so I'll try to merge a couple at the same time. A couple of people asked about any particular, whether it's formal or informal regulatory guidelines you know of in terms of using AI in our practice, whether it's more administrative or actual ethics, and somebody even specifically bringing up, are the updates to the specialty guidelines relevant to AI, or have they touched on that at all?
That is a great question. From what I have heard, those who are responsible for updating, for incorporating those kinds of things into some professional guidelines and those kinds of sources of authority are talking about this stuff. There is an AI task force through ABPP, I believe, that is also trying to keep their finger on the pulse. But for those of you who might have seen Dr. DiMattio's presentation on the specialty guidelines many moons ago, these things move really slowly, which is at odds with the speed that we know AI is developing. So I think we're kind of caught in this very strange space where we have a technology that's developing. It's improving, but still showing problems at kind of this quicker rate. And it takes years for some of these guidelines to come out. So I know this stuff is being talked about. It's in the works. the bigger question that I unfortunately don't have an answer to is like when we could expect those kinds of sources of authority to become available. But it's a great question.
Several people asked about considerations in terms of documenting or citing use of AI. I think some of these questions are similar to ones that Jenny Crispin got a few weeks ago. But some people asked about where the line is. So, for example, would you document a program like Grammarly in a report for clarifying a report now that it uses AI to help with editing? And somebody said on the other extreme, like, am I supposed to then consult the or am I supposed to cite that I consulted the DSM if I use it in my report? Like, where do we draw the line here?
Yeah. So we don't have any, right? This might be a thing that rolls out in a set of guidelines at some point. But I think right now, all we can do is use our best judgment. So the way I think about it is if it is something you would normally cite in a report or in a professional communication, and now you have used AI to do that task, then cite that you've used AI to do that task. If you typically have used Grammarly to, or even Microsoft Words like spell checker to help identify when you need a comma, when you need to get rid of a comma, when something's misspelled, you probably don't cite that you're using that feature. And so if you're using Grammarly to help with that, then that might not be something where you need to cite the use of AI. If you do cite the use of AI, the APA has put guidelines out for how to structure that format and that citation for any of you like APA publication manual nerds like I am. So we do have some guidelines there, but at this point in time, I feel like the best way to approach this is to, when in doubt, cite it, of course, but also to use judgment. If it's something where AI is not doing the work for you, or if you're double checking, then you might be safe to include it, or I'm sorry, not include it, but just kind of proceed with caution.
I know you've addressed several people's different concerns about the use of AI. Several people have asked questions related to like how do I opt out of this. A more general question would be: could you address concerns of colleagues and institutions who have AI loaded onto their computers and are being told to use it for various reasons?
Oh, that's interesting. So I think it kind of depends on the situation. I know there are some jurisdictions that, like a state system or a system at large, has adopted the use of AI and instructed its employees, its evaluators, insert person here, to use that technology. And I think in those cases, the best case scenario, the best thing we could do is to just be curious and ask the questions that we need to ask, to ensure that we know what we're using and how it's being used and like what protections exist for the data that we might enter into it, right? Because if you're ultimately working for a jurisdiction and they're like, we're using AI now, go for it. I can't speak to what might happen to your job if you say, I'm not doing that, go pound wood or whatever. But so I think in cases like that, where whole companies or jurisdictions or entities are doing that, the best thing to do is to go to the people who might have those answers for you, to make sure that you understand what that technology is being used for, how it's being used, are there problems with it that you as the forensic minded person need to think about, and how to mitigate that kind of stuff. I think starting a conversation about this stuff and not just being a passive user of the technology might be the best way to like navigate some of those situations. Hopefully that's helpful.
And somewhat related to your discussion about error rates here, somebody asked, how do models, from your understanding, respond to instructions to assess their degree of confidence in a given answer?
Yeah. Oh boy. So I will give you this answer based on what I know. I think this gets to like some of the more like under the hood functions of AI. So I'm going to give you what I think here, but this might not be a complete answer. Some recent updates from some of the AI generated platforms have shown us or have told us that AI is starting to become familiar with why you might be asking it questions. So if there was a study done on Claude and like political sycophancy, so trying to get it to like roll with fake news or what have you, right? This kind of like political echo chamber that can lead to all sorts of terrible things. And what the platform identified was that in this study, people were asking it political questions, and it said, hold on a minute. I think I know what you're trying to do here. You're trying to figure out if I'm going to do any number of these things, and I'm not doing that. And so the reason I talk about that is I think if we start thinking about these error rates and how AI goes about conceptualizing its own error rates, I think it's important to talk about kind of the filter that we're looking at this through, which is that these programs are now starting to catch on to why we're asking and have the potential to edit responses based on why it thinks we're asking. I don't know if that's a full answer to that question. But that information is what came to mind with that question or concern.
Gotcha. And one final, a little bit more concrete question here as we wrap up here. Somebody asked if you have a platform that you recommend for dictation, not transcribing the interview, but for dictation.
I don't. I have not used it in that way, but I think this would be a great opportunity to visit those APA resources, the companion checklist and the tool guide, and to just do a an internet search of what AI platforms exist for dictation. Is there a BAA? Is it HIPAA compliant, right? What happens to that data? Walk through those things that the APA suggests, and then engage in that thought exercise to see if it makes sense to use whatever you end up finding.
Well, Dana, Dr. Formon, thank you so much for everything you've done to facilitate these discussions on our considerations as artificial intelligence is more and more in the public dialogue, more and more in our lives, and considerations that we as forensic practitioners could think of in a practical way to consider this in our practice. Thank you so much for opening the door for these conversations.
Anytime.
Yeah, and that wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week, we have Drs. Terry Cooker and Dr. Julie Goldenson, who will be discussing trauma-informed supervision of forensic trainees. We hope to see you then for another great discussion of issues in behavioral health and the law. Until next time.